Well, welcome back to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, where we've been just walking through some of the basics of aircraft insurance. And we've spent the last several episodes going through kind of the policy structure and different sections of a policy. And most recently, we were talking about exclusions. Well, there's a couple major exclusions that kind of need their own attention. And I'm going to talk about those today and in the next episode. And really, these exclusions are applicable to pretty much every insurance policy, but certainly every aircraft policy, every aviation general liability policy. And so the one we're going to talk about today is called the War Risk and Allied Perils Exclusion. London terms had some AVN 52, and it may be called something else, but it goes like this. And I'm going to read it. It's pretty standard what the exclusion is in most insurance policies. So this policy or coverage will not apply to coverage. So exclusion part A, war, invasion, acts of foreign enemies, hostilities, whether war be declared or not, civil war, rebellion, revolution, insurrection, martial law, military or usurped power, or attempts at usurpation of power. Okay. There's some words in here I didn't think much about a couple of years ago, but today I'm thinking a little bit more about them. The second part is B, any hostile detonation of any weapon of war employing atomic or nuclear fission and or fusion and or like reaction or radioactive force or matter. Folks, nuclear is always excluded in every policy. A nuclear detonation, explosion, fission or fusion is always excluded. It's called a fundamental risk because it is so great that no one insurance company or combination of insurance companies could bear that loss. And if we have that problem, we've got bigger issues than just who's going to restore the property. So nuclear is excluded. B. C, strikes, riots, civil commotions, and or labor disturbances. All right. So they're not going to pay losses related to strikes, riots, civil commotions, or labor disturbances. Man, I'm seeing a lot of that in the news in the last year or two. D, any act of one or more persons, whether or not agents of a sovereign power, for political or terrorist purposes, and whether the loss or resulting or damage resulting there is accidental or intentional. Part E of the exclusion, any malicious act or act of sabotage. That's a pretty broad one. The next one's very important to aircraft owners: confiscation, nationalization, seizure, restraint, detention, appropriation, requisition for title or use by or under the order of any government, whether civil, military, or de facto, or public or local authority. We'll spend a little more time on this in a minute. And then G, the traditional one you think about, hijacking or any unlawful seizure or wrongful exercise of control of the aircraft or crew, including any attempt at such seizure or control made by any person or persons on board the aircraft without your consent. So I can't go into absolutely everything we can consider here today, but I want to highlight a few key points. So in this exclusion, we saw the war. That makes sense, but I see this word insurrection, martial law, attempts at usurpation of power. Okay. Again, these are words I've been seeing in the news in the last year and a half that I didn't see really before. So that's something to keep in mind as we think about what's usually excluded, if not written back. B, nuclear, always excluded. C, strikes, riots, civil commotions, or labor disturbances. We've seen an increasing number of these. They happen for a number of reasons, and they happen all over the country. So, do you think a strike or riot or civil commotion or labor disturbance could occur at an airport? Absolutely. Could it affect any kind of aircraft? Absolutely. An act of any one or more persons, whether or not agents of a sovereign power, right? The political or terrorist purposes. Man, in the last 20 years, we've had to look at the potential terrorist threats in a new light. And so anything related, whether or not a sovereign power or not, for political or terrorist purposes, that's excluded. That could be a big deal. E was any malicious act or act of sabotage. Man, again, I said that's broad. Any malicious act, right? I'm mad at these people. I'm going to cut the brake lines. I'm going to put something in an exhaust container or in the engine area, in anything like that. Malicious act or act of sabotage is excluded according to the War Risk and Allied Perils exclusion. All right, confiscation, nationalization, seizure, restraint, detention. I'm not going to read the whole thing again. Folks, we've had this happen where a charter flight was operated in the United States from the original destination, the original departation. So from the departure airport, which was in the United States, to an adjacent state that was also in the United States. As the charter operator was taxiing out, the aircraft was confiscated. And he complied with everything, answered all questions. He'd actually followed all rules. No rules were broken on his part. But the 7 passengers did turn out to be illegal aliens. So they confiscated his airplane. And folks, it is quite a process. If your aircraft's confiscated and you want to get it back, in a lot of cases, you might not. Okay. And government entities may be hoping you don't so they can sell it at auction or keep it. But, and that's conjecture. So take it for what it's worth. They may not want to do that, but, it could take months to get an aircraft back if you are legal and have every legal reason to have it. There is a process of going through different, attorney generals and providing responses and letting them have time to respond. You can be without an aircraft for a significant amount of time. If you're in a foreign country and that government takes it, you're not getting it back. So that is going to be excluded unless you have the war risk right back. So a very important one. People used to say you only need war risk if you've got a big aircraft traveling outside the country or if you're traveling outside the country. I hope today the one thing you take away is that pretty much everybody needs war risk coverage if they can at all possibly afford it. Finally, hijacking or any unlawful seizure or wrongful exercise of control of the aircraft or crew. Anyway, hijacking. We often think of the airlines, bigger aircraft. I was actually witness to a situation in the Midwest, right in the middle of the country, where somebody robbed a bank, took a hostage, drove a vehicle to an airport, and was going to attempt to hijack and take a single-engine Cessna and depart with it as his getaway. In this process, the police caught up to him and exchanged gunfire with him, with the robber being in between the aircraft and the police. So unfortunately, the aircraft did sustain some bullet holes. The carrier did pay it, but that was a potential hijacking. It could have been considered that potentially, but the carrier paid it. It was in the middle of the United States, and it was with a 4-person single-engine Cessna. So a lot of people think, well, just a turbine needs war risk. No. War risk is an exposure via hijacking, via malicious acts, via confiscation, strikes, riots, civil commotions, or labor disturbances, being a part of insurrection, right? All these different reasons. All these things are excluded unless you buy back the War Risk and Allied Perils limited right back, right? So more than more is just excluded. The right back coverages, the endorsements are available to both whole and or the liability coverages, except for B. They can write back all but one of those coverages, which is the nuclear. It's always excluded. For higher limit aircraft, war coverage typically has a sublimit of $50 million. And then usually what happens is we go and get excess war liability to cover the difference between the 50 million limit and whatever limit of liability is required. And then war risk coverage, the right back has some unique cancellation provisions. It is automatically terminated if war is declared between UN Security Council members. There's automatic termination of coverage of A upon hostile detonation of nuclear weapons. Anytime nuclear is involved, automatic no coverage. Coverage B and C can be terminated within 2 days' notice. And then 7-day notice of cancellation can be issued if the world events dictate. And that's what happened on September 11th of 2001. Thereafter, 7-day notice of cancellation was sent out as applicable to the war risk, right back coverages, and then later on was offered again at a much higher premium because the war risk market sustained a lot of the September 11th losses and needed a whole lot more premium for what their exposure was in today's new world. War risk will often be required by some lenders. Anybody flying over the European Union or around or near will be required to carry war risk coverage along with some other requirements. And you get into some of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet or people flying for the Defense Department. There's some other specific things that need to be done in relation to war risk, or can be done in relation to war risk and some other operations. But again, this is just a quick survey to revisit that war risk exclusion that's pretty much present on all policies, and then to briefly introduce that right back you can get. It is a coverage that I am recommending more, pretty much everyone consider. In fact, you consider this message, certainly if you're in the aviation business, airport, small aircraft, big aircraft, you really need to consider war risk and allied perils right back coverage. So that is the key thing I hope you take away today. It's not just for certain aircraft. It's not just for aircraft traveling outside the country. There's an exposure for everyone, but it can be expensive. So that certainly is a consideration. We've got another related exclusion and endorsement that we will discuss in the next episode on Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. So that is all for this week. So join us again next time as we continue navigating the waypoints in aviation insurance. Until then, enjoy clear skies and unlimited visibility.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes, and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aeris Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit aerosinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer: these episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.